But in that center ring, Putin, he's playing games. And he's playing games with smoke and mirrors to try to deflect. But I really think as much as we're all talking about peace, we need to be focused more on what Putin is saying. And Putin is actually saying he wants more war.
Joining us today are retired U.S. Army Colonel John Sweet and Foreign Affairs and Security Policy expert Mark Toth. Welcome to our program.
Hey, great to be back on the show, Sophia.
Great to see you, Sophia. Thank you.
This week actually kicked off with intense diplomacy. Ukraine, European leaders and U.S. delegations all at the table. Mark, what's your take on the recent developments and early outcomes so far?
Sophia, it is a great question because it's the holiday season. It's the time of peace and goodwill toward men for those of us that are Christians. And I know Ukraine principally is a Christian country. But it's also a time of reality. War brings a lot home to us as individuals, as a people, and as a country. And unfortunately, as John and I wrote in our own Substack, in Trip 360, but also which was just recently reprinted in the Kiev Post, it's still a bit of a three-ring circus. Everyone has a different idea of what peace means. John delved into that on TVP World late last week, basically saying, look, Putin views peace as a means still to get what he wants, which is all of Ukraine. The United States, sadly, at least the Trump administration, views peace as something to get a business deal out of. And Ukraine views peace as, alongside Europe, as its long-term survival as a sovereign country. And those three rings of this circus are not lining up together still. We still see, look, I think Trump's being straightforward. He's not doing the right thing in terms of backing Ukraine to the hilt. And Zelensky's being straightforward in terms of saying this is what our red lines are. We can't get rid of the Donbass. But in that center ring, Putin, he's playing games. And he's playing games with smoke and mirrors to try to deflect. But I really think as much as we're all talking about peace, we need to be focused more on what Putin is saying. And Putin is actually saying he wants more war.
And on security guarantees, actually from media reporting, we've heard that the U.S. might offer security guarantees to Ukraine and something like linked before Article 5 or based on Article 5 example. John, particularly speaking, what could this kind of guarantees look for Kiev in practical means? And do you think will they actually work?
I'm not familiar with what exactly those security guarantees are. There's a lot of discussion that the United States is offering guarantees, but there's been no real discussion on what those guarantees are. Okay, and the other piece is this. Zelensky understands he can't have security guarantees that are simply written on a piece of paper like a Budapest memorandum. He needs a binding treaty. He needs a document that's going to ensure that the countries that sign those documents come to his support when it is needed. And unfortunately, unless NATO forces or U.S. forces physically reside on Ukrainian territory, that's not going to happen because they're going to call for NATO Article 4 proceedings. They're going to call for NATO Article 5 proceedings. The NATO bureaucracy is going to prevent any forces to come across the border to support Ukraine if Russia attacks again. And that, quite frankly, is the biggest fear that Zelensky has, is that Russia's going to attack again, and he's not going to have any support to defend against. He's not going to have, if Russia gets their way, he's not going to have a standing military that can react. He's not going to have the weapon systems that he needs to defeat them, and he's not going to have forces on the ground that can help him defend his country. So I'm not sure what a security guarantee is and what it looks like, and we won't know until it's actually published.
And it's quite interesting to follow these topics and to follow the proposals for security guarantees, because we know that Russia is totally against NATO membership, because of course it would mean that NATO troops will support Ukraine if Russia attacks again. And here from the US side, from media, from European leaders, we hear that US might be ready to provide this an Article 5 type guarantee to Ukraine. So actually, I'm curious why would Russia even consider to agree on this, Mark? What do you think?
Yeah, no, Sophia, I don't think they will. Look, you even have Lavrov out overnight for us here in the United States, basically saying that the United States has agreed to make sure the swap of territories happens and has agreed to, push this thing forward more on Russian terms than in fair and equitable terms for Ukraine in terms of a peace. That's just not acceptable. And so, at this time of the year, there are many grandparents who give their kids a book called If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. It was written by Laura Numeroff. And basically, it's like if you keep giving a child a cookie or a mouse, they're going to keep asking for more. Most kids learn this around the age of 3 or 4. Trump, the man who's responsible for the Art of the Deal book, seemingly doesn't. He just keeps giving Russia more and more, and they keep asking for more negotiating cookies in return. That just has to stop. That can't happen. In terms of the actual security agreements themselves, yes, absolutely. I don't think Russia's going to accept them. I think that's a red line for them. They've made that clear. And they're not going to change that position until they start losing more on the battlefield. That's how you counteract that Russian demand. But in terms of the security guarantees themselves, John's right. You have a gray zone here. You even have Lavrov basically saying we want to go back to 1997 now in terms of what Ukraine and Europe and NATO look like, meaning, hey, Sweden can't belong to NATO anymore. Finland can't belong to anymore. Again, just more examples of them taking more and more cookies or asking for them. It's not acceptable. The other thing I'd point out real quickly here is, remember, these kind of security guarantees, to have any real meeting under U.S. law, would have to be ratified by the U.S. Senate. That takes time. That takes legislation. What happens in the meantime? Say that takes a year and a half for that cycle to occur in the U.S. Senate. What happens in the meantime if Russia attacks Ukraine again during some kind of ceasefire? Then those aren't so ironclad. So NATO is the safest route in terms of Ukraine joining it, but I think it's still a red line because I think they can get away with it for Russia.
Hey, Sophia, let me add one point to that. And there's a great quote from German Chancellor Merz last week in which he said, America first is fine, but America alone cannot be in your interest. Okay. And right now, the United States is treating the peace deal as a peace deal between the United States and Russia. And they're ignoring the fact that Ukraine has a vote. Europe has a vote. They have input. They're making this all about themselves at the expense of NATO and Europe. And they need to reach back out to those two, because as much as Zelensky bends to try to foster a sense of negotiation and peace settlement, Russia continues to take, and the Trump administration, as Mark said, continues to offer. So right now, it's the Trump administration that simply wants this more than Ukraine and Russia. And until this becomes about Ukraine, this will never pass muster.
And indeed, if we are talking about the right for a voice and for a decision, we know that a red line, one of the red lines, of course, for Kyiv now is the decision not to cede the full Donbas to Russia. John, I would like you to explain to our viewers why it's so important to keep Donbas and to keep even this still small territory, Ukrainian-controlled territory of Donbas, and not giving it up to Russians.
Of course, look, Ukraine has its fortress, the Donbas fortress, okay? That fortress has been occupied for the past 4 years. That fortress has prevented Russia from invading, if you will, on a fast avenue of approach to Kyiv and also to Odessa. Russia has not been able to penetrate that. Russia has lost thousands of soldiers, tens of thousands of soldiers in attempts to take that. What they want through negotiations is to secure that terrain. And again, they can't secure it with their military force. They want it through negotiations, okay? If they get that terrain, if they are able to take all of the Donbas, and whether you call it Donbas or a free economic zone or whatever you want to call it, if they own that terrain, they own if you will, the avenues of approach to Kyiv and Odessa, and it's just a matter of time before they reset and come at those two cities again, and ultimately the fate of Ukraine as a sovereign country. So that's the significance of the pictures. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, so Sophia, if I could here, maybe I could, because John described it brilliantly from a military standpoint. If I could put it in layman's terms, think of the fortress Donbass, this fortress that John and I talk and write about a lot. Think of that as a Ukrainian fist that is pointed directly at the Russian front lines. And around that fist, if you look at the battlefield, go to the ISW maps, pay attention to them, like as far north as Sumy, then you've got Kharkiv, and then you've got Pokrovsk in the south. The Russians keep trying to break into that fist, but they can't. They can't do sweeping maneuver. They can't advance because that fist remains there, stopping them from taking territory that they want. If you take that fist away because of a peace agreement, then suddenly what Russia has been trying to do for 3.5 years now, almost 4 come February, is you give them that territory if they ever want to take it. And as John said, no matter what you call it, free economic zones, etc., if that fist goes away, Ukraine's security goes away, in my opinion.
Let's talk about Russian position in these negotiations. You already said that you've heard from Lavrov and from other officials that there is, you say, no willingness to negotiate. I also noted that, and I also know that Putin himself continued to insist on their goals in this war, and also on how they call it root causes. They want still continue to fight for it. And what are the signs from the US on that? Does Washington really see what's going on in Russia in Moscow's position? Because it seems that they are just playing around.
Yeah, Sophia, I'll be quick here because, from the U.S. side, they just want to get the deal done. John has often argued that this is just about money, about business deals, about the day after of some kind of peace getting struck in Ukraine. If you're the Russians, and again, just follow Kirill Dmitriev's account on Twitter, they're just sitting back going, hey, we'll spin this narrative, we'll spin that narrative. One day it's about Nazis, one day it's about resetting to 1997, one day it's about Kiev and Rusk and this mythical empire that Putin wants to reestablish. They're willing to throw out any narrative out there to get Trump to keep giving them stuff. And you know what? It's working. That's what's so maddening about this. But it's not serious. I mean, it's just, as we said, as John and I wrote in the Kiev Post just recently, it's a three-ring circus, and it makes no sense. It's not leading to a conclusion that anyone's going to be able to accept at this point. John, you have any thoughts on that?
I got plenty of thoughts. We just don't have time for me to capture them all. Look, I'll go back to what we've said before. The root cause of this is Putin, okay? And it's everything that Mark just said. At the end of the day, he despises Ukraine. He despises their sovereignty. He despises the fact that Russia allowed them to separate from the Soviet Union and become an independent state. Okay, he despises that. He despises Zelensky because of the way Zelensky depicted him when he was an actor as a clown. Okay, so no, all that has to do with Putin. This is a Putin problem, okay? And the sooner that the United States and their negotiating team understand that Putin is the problem, and it's not all things that he has stated. It is simply him. He is the root cause, and you have to address the root cause. And until the United States addresses that, until the United States stands up and says, okay, we're not doing this anymore, this is what's going to happen, we're going to continue to spin our wheels. And unfortunately, spinning the wheels equals, according to Donald Trump at least, 1,000 casualties a week. 1,000 casualties a day for Russia, 7,000 a week. It's going to result in more civilian casualties because, as we know, Russia is going to continue to bomb Ukraine, civilian infrastructure, civilian residential neighborhoods with ballistic missiles and drones. And they're going to continue their assaults on the ground. Until something changes, and right now nothing's changed other than the incentives that the Trump administration seems to want to give them, we're going to be on this path for a while.
Following this topic, you probably also know that Dmitry Peskov has dismissed the idea of a Christmas ceasefire. What's your reaction on that?
Yeah, I'm not surprised that they dismissed the ceasefire because, quite frankly, from their perspective, any type of freeze enables the other side to build strength, to build combat power, and then at the conclusion of the ceasefire, come at them again. So they don't want to break momentum, and we're not going to see. There's not going to be a Christmas ceasefire. This is not rational actor. Okay, it's that's just not going to happen.
Mark, any reactions on maybe from the political perspective? Because just yesterday it was some hope from the European and Ukrainian side on a Christmas ceasefire.
Yeah, I think it's hopeful. But look, the problem is, as John just pointed out, is that this is not a rational actor. Look, I don't blame Pritchett Mertz coming out and saying that. We have values in the West that simply are not shared by Putin and his cronies at the Kremlin. We still have to stay true to them. We still have to try to make that our guiding star. But the reality is that Putin is not going to follow that peace plan. He probably, if anything, will use Christmas to send more of a message that means war and war at all costs until he gets everything that he wants. Look, there's a young man in your country, Roman Alexeyev, I hope I'm saying it correctly, the young ballroom dancer who was, disfigured by burns in an attack in 2022 that killed his mother. And he's really kind of captured the hearts of Americans over the last couple of days as that video of him went viral when the EU interpreters started breaking down, hearing this young man poignantly but bravely, without his own voice wavering, talking about his story, Ukraine's story, and the story that's affected other kids. In that he's the face of Putin's evil, really. And not the boy himself, but what Putin has done to him. But he's also the heart of Ukraine, this young man, who's basically saying, we're going to stand up to Russian tyranny. And I think Putin can't tolerate that. That kid's message is stronger than Putin's desire for war. And I think it'll win out. But we have to stay strong. We can't get fooled that Putin believes that peace is coming anytime soon, unless that means the end of Ukraine. And that's just not acceptable. Politics-wise, I hope that message gets through to Washington, to more people on Capitol Hill, but not enough so far. But fortunately, Roman's out there representing your country admirably.
Hey, can I add one point? And it's actually more than one point, but it's is that Russia, quite frankly, wants to project strength. Russia, quite frankly, wants the United States and Europe to believe that they're winning. And every time Putin, while dressed up in a military uniform in the confines of the safety of the bunker in Moscow, says his troops have advanced to a certain point, Zelensky shows up at that certain point and takes a selfie. Zelensky calls him out. Zelensky calls the bluff. So not only is he not winning on the battlefield, and his generals are telling him what he wants to hear, Ukraine continues to innovate, and Ukraine continues to strike into Russia. I mean, they just recently sunk a Kilo-class submarine in a Russian seaport, right? In the Black Sea, they also destroyed what was considered to be an elite unit, the 76th Guards Air Assault Division. So they continue to rack up battlefield wins as Putin continues to project strength that simply doesn't exist. So that's where we are. It's about time people start to realize that what they're being told by Russia, quite frankly, just isn't the truth. And just watch what you see on the television.
And here is a question about do they still have the capacity to fight, and how urgent for Russians actually to have these peace negotiations, also taking into account the economic pressure and recent sanctions?
So the answer is yes, they still have the capacity to fight. And I mean by Russia, I mean that. Russia, tells you, or at least Putin would tell you, that he has upwards to 470,000 or 500,000 soldiers that are actually in occupied portions of Ukraine. And maybe they do, or maybe they don't. But they certainly have manpower. They certainly have boots on the ground. They certainly have warm bodies and uniforms. But do they have the right military equipment other than, human, what we identified earlier as meat assaults, full frontal assaults? If that's what they have, then Ukraine has, the remedy against mass, and that's in modern weapons. That's cluster munitions, that's drones. I mean, they're killing, again, upwards of 900 to 1,000 a day. But as long as Russia is able to continue to bring bodies into the equation, not necessarily the weapon systems, the weapons that they're relying upon are ballistic missiles and drones to do deep strikes. They're losing the close fight to Ukrainian soldiers, okay? That's what they're losing. The question comes down to just how long can he continue to put bodies in uniforms and send them to the front? And I think the answer to that question is probably indefinitely, just because of the sheer volume that he has. Therefore, Ukraine has to come up with a solution to interdict those forces before they arrive into Ukraine. They have to increase the cost calculus, and they need Europe and U.S. support in order to do that.
Mark, and do you see that actually political will in Europe and the US to continue to support Ukraine, especially if war continues?
Look, fortunately, Sophia, the vast majority, upwards of 70% of American people, according to a recent Reagan Defense survey, wants Ukraine to prevail. Just as many believe that Russia is the enemy, not our friend. And so there's a huge connect. John actually drove a piece for us last week in the Hill called The Jarring Disconnect that Trump has with respect to Ukraine. So I'm hopeful that at some point that equation changes. But now the political reality in D.C. is that Trump himself, along with people like J.D. Vance, don't want to see that. Europe, look, I would put it in these terms. This is about Europe's long-term fate. Friedrich Merz was right when he said Ukraine's fate is Europe's fate, and it needs to be treated that way. But that means stepping up enough, and again, I apologize if my anger is showing through, but it's real anger, enough of telling Ukraine, come for a photo op, come sit down with us. These guys now, being Starmer, Macron, Merz, to the point where they're giving deliverables to Ukraine. That can be in the form of a no-fly zone protecting Western Ukraine. That can be in the form of Taurus missiles, so that, as John pointed out, they can do more effective deep strike interdictions, if not take down that Kerch Bridge, connecting Crimea to Russia as a good symbolic message. We're not done. We're not giving up. Or all of the above. It's time that Europe acts. They can't just keep talking about it. We can't just keep having photo ops about it. Everything's at stake here. And Ukraine's survival, in my opinion, is likely Europe's survival, at least in Eastern Europe. If not, it's going to be a return to the Iron Curtain days, most likely.
And last question about frozen Russian assets, because this week European leaders are meeting in Brussels, and the topic on the agenda, of course, is a reparation loan for Ukraine. And we know that Belgium is blocking the decision due to the potential risks of the Russia going to court. So I would like to ask you, do you see a deal soon?
Look, I hope, but I honestly think that these reparations more are about what Europe can send as a message to Putin. So I'm going to flip to John here for the last word on this, Sophia, because I think those funds really need to be in the form of a military message, and not just an economic one. John, your thoughts there?
Yeah, we Mark and I talk about this a lot, and we debate this a lot too. This is, again, as Mark said, this is just more talk. Okay, it's more talk, and it requires more action. Belgium's concern is that quite frankly, is that Putin survives this, and that Putin comes back and comes out to Belgium in the form of lawsuits or form of sanctions or energy or something. But Belgium's concerned that there will be repercussions against them. NATO and the rest of Europe need to step up and assure Belgium that's not going to happen. Okay, they need to address those calls, and it's not just Belgium. We already know that Hungary and Slovakia aren't going to support this either. Okay, so there comes a time where if the EU coalition is not going to work because of 2 members, and the NATO coalition is not going to work because of 3 members, and the coalition of willing is not going to work because they're not doing, they're going to have to look inward, and they're going to have to come up with other types of, if you will, short-term alliances in order to overcome the problem. And then they're going to have to take a real hard look at these organizations and these memberships, because quite frankly, majority votes, where you need 32 all yay votes, they're going to have to look at that and say, this isn't feasible anymore. We'll never get 32 countries to agree upon something, maybe a supermajority, but an absolute majority simply isn't working. And the bureaucracy that it's causing is time and something that, quite frankly, Ukrainian civilians in their homes can't afford.
Yeah, Sophia, real quick here, if I could put an exclamation mark here. What's most disappointing about the position that Belgium is taking? I'm not surprised about Hungary. I'm not surprised about Slovakia. They've made it clear what the positions are. But enough of Europe, especially Brussels, fearing the Russians winning. You can't make decisions based on Russia winning. Europe has in its power to make sure that that does not happen. And yet, the message that I get from Brussels is that we fear Putin's winning more than we want Ukraine to win. That's just messed up. That's just madness. Enough of that. Europe has to find its self-confidence. It needs to stand up for freedom in Ukraine. It can do that. Stop fearing Putin. It's a game. It's smoke and mirrors. He doesn't have the strength that Europe fears that he does.
Thank you both for our today's discussion and for your insights on these topics.
Hey, Sophia, thanks for having us, and Merry Christmas to you and everyone in Ukraine.
Great. Thank you, Sophia. Merry Christmas as well to everyone. Take care.